Good afternoon, everyone. It's Lisa Ling, and today I am just so thrilled and humbled to be talking about something that all of us will experience at some point in our lives if we haven't already, and that is grief, which is not just something that happens after loss, but something that many of us live with long before, especially for caregivers and care partners. Grief can show up in a myriad of ways that we might not even know how to identify. And so our panelists today work closely with the realities of dying and loss and understand how much support, preparation, and community matter in these moments. Now, these conversations about approaching end of life with more honesty and presence and about how understanding grief can actually deepen the way we live and care for one another. These conversations they're sensitive, and I want to acknowledge that this is going to be a tender conversation, so be sure to practice whatever self-care that you might need during this time. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our incredible panelists today. First off, we have Casey Giconyo. She is a nationally recognized death doula, educator, and speaker working at the intersection of healthcare, death care, and grief. We also have Bruce Bradley Gilbert, and he practices as a psychotherapist, art therapist, and has been running caregiver support groups with HFC for several years, including a bereavement group. And last but not least, we have Alua Arthur, who is perhaps the most visible death doula in the world today. She's a New York Times bestselling author, Time 100 Health Honoree, and the founder of Going with Grace. Alua and her team have trained almost 3,000 death doulas in 58 countries. I just want to welcome all of you for being here today, and I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. First off, Alua, I'll start with you. There's this common saying that we've all heard, which is, I haven't had time to grieve. My first question really is, how do we know how to grieve? And how will we know when the grief has passed?
That's such a rich question, Lisa, and thank you for asking it because I think many of us have misconceptions about what grief actually is. I think a lot of folks believe that grief is something that you do when you're crying or when you're sad or when you feel disconnected from life. But in fact, many of us are often grieving sometimes without even our conscious awareness of it. Because grief looks like so many different things. There are the easily identifiable ones that I just spoke about, but sometimes people grieve by moving at a mile a minute, and after a death occurs, they're handling everything really quickly. They're not sitting down. They're baking dishes and running errands, and that's grieving too. There's also a common misconception about the timeline of grief that you do grief and then you move on from grief. I think many of us wish that to be true because of the pain of grieving. But the reality is that once grief comes in and settles in, it changes form over our lifetimes. I got into the work of the death doula because my brother-in-law died 12 years ago. And I noticed that the acute pain of the loss is not as strong. I don't cry every time I think of him now. Sometimes I laugh. Sometimes I feel sad that he doesn't know this version of me. Sometimes I wonder what he would have made of the world. And that's still grief. That is still grief. Grief isn't a destination we arrive at, but rather something that we live with over the course of our lives.
Bruce, I'm emotional just even thinking about this topic because my father passed away last year. Um, I think I think many people are resistant about grieving because it hurts so much. It's so painful. But in the end, are we doing more harm than good by not allowing ourselves to grieve?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Lisa. I think we're doing more harm than good. You're right. Um, I think moving into grief is probably one of the most terrifying things in the world for any of us to do. I in my work, I'd like to distinguish a little bit between anticipating grief and what we call the post-loss grief. And a lot of my work it kind of is contained in between of those two places. Clearly, anticipatory grief applies profoundly when we're caregiving somebody with a memory disorder like Alzheimer's. We slowly lose them. And as we slowly lose them, we're adjusting to being able to be with them, loving them, caring for them. And then the post-loss grief is when they die, when they physically die. One of the things two things I wanted to speak to about that, and I can speak more, but one is the complexity of how caring for people with a memory disorder, the grief is complex. And for some people, they can manage it just fine. For other people, it can turn into something called complex grief or prolonged grief, which really requires extra help. And the last thing I just want to speak about this is that interim period between moving from anticipatory grief to post-loss grief. It can be confusing for caregivers. And I like to say that when somebody dies, it doesn't mean you stop being the caregiver. In fact, the role of a caregiver just slowly shifts and changes. Some very powerful work can happen. That happened with my groups, some of which is storytelling, some of which is sharing things like, and I'm sure Alua and Casey will speak to these, but sometimes there are dreams, sometimes there are visitations. And these are all stories in our experiences that need to get out.
Sorry, I have a little dog barking in the background, but I'm going to persist anyway. She just got spooked a little bit. Casey, you and Alu are both death doulas. You are also a former bedside nurse with over a decade of experience. But for those who are unfamiliar with the role, what does a death doula actually do, and what do they not do?
Yeah, great question. I love to explain death doulas like this. A lot of people have heard of a birthing doula, and so a death doula is similar to a birthing doula, only on the opposite end of life. So, we help people to labor out of life, but with intention. I also like to say you can think of us as the project manager of your most important project, your final chapter, the final chapter of your life. So you asked, what do death doulas do and what do we not do? Well, death doulas are non-medical. So I am an RN. I came from the healthcare field where we did do medical things, but death doulas are very non-medical. That's what hospice is for. Hospice handles the medical side of death and dying, and death doulas handle the non-medical side of that. I like to say that hospice is there to help your body labor out of life, and a death doula is there to help your soul labor out of life. So we help you plan for your best ending. We help you to create legacy projects that you can leave behind for those that you're leaving behind. We provide emotional support, spiritual support, practical support, logistical support. But most importantly, the one thing that we don't do is provide medical support. We just work hand in hand with hospice and let them handle the medical side of things.
Lua, also as a death doula, you are as well an attorney and a New York Times bestselling author, and you're also the founder of Going with Grace, which brings compassion to the cycle of life by planning for one's passing, and you also train end of life doulas. So, what do you believe most of us just misunderstand about death, and how does that misunderstanding shape the way we live?
There's a lot we misunderstand about death. I think one of the key components is that we think death is something that's happening out there and to other people all the time, that we depersonalize the idea of our own mortality one day. And that's something that I find caregivers do often, understandably, because the job of caregiving is so consuming, caring for the death, this caring for the life of another. And when that death eventually occurs, that sometimes shines the light back on the caregiver, which may be a shock if there hasn't been any time to integrate the ideas of our own mortality. But I think it's really important that we are constantly bringing awareness to our mortality while we live. death doulas can also work with people while they are healthy to complete comprehensive end-of-life planning. I find that when I'm called in to support in a situation where somebody is dying and they're either familial or paid caregivers present, that they also sometimes start thinking about the plans that they want to have in place so that their dying perhaps comes a little easier. I think another big misconception about death, huge, is people think that dying looks like it does in the movies. You know, somebody's laying there perfectly coiffed, looking like they did the entire movie long, and they cross their hands over and they say two or three words and then they're gone, you know. But those that are caregiving folks, those of us that work with death and dying, see that that's not the case, that dying is a long, integrated process. And this misconception about how we die and how bodies die sometimes has the effect of traumatizing or making people judge the dying of the person that they loved in a way that isn't favorable. But, you know, dying just is, and it looks like a lot of different ways. And we're trying to spread a lot more education about what dying actually looks like so people aren't surprised by it when it's happening.
When my father passed away, I was actually kind of surprised by the fact that at that very moment, I didn't feel sad because when he passed, um, I just saw his body sort of, his body died, but it was no longer my father. It was just a very tired body. And I still felt his spirit very much alive and very much in my presence. And Bruce, I wonder, so many people just go through such a range of emotional responses. Some caretakers even feel guilt or shame. I mean, because I didn't feel that immediate sadness, I did feel like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I feel um, more sadness? And I felt some shame around that. How can we normalize those
Mm,
kinds of feelings?
mm. That's a, thank you for that question. I think that the answer to that question lies in the name Hilarity for Charity. You know, when I started working, I was really perplexed. Why the hell are you talking about, dementia using the word hilarity? What's funny about it? And, in some ways, I kind of knew the answer to that. And I think, Alua, you referenced it. This business is messy. Um, it's a messy business, but it's also a business with people we're used to being professional. I think of my grandmother, going into the hospital for the last time. The only thing she cared about was whether she had clean underwear. And, you know, and it's like, Graham, you're very sick. Don't worry about it. The doctor's not going to assess your underwear. So I find in my work, sort of a similar thing happens where people feel they have to do this bereavement, caregiving to bereavement to death, in a very clean, precise way. And so that's not realistic. Um, so a lot of people come into my work with some profound, deep regrets and strong feelings that they feel like they're not allowed to have. We do have to get into them. Like in the Hilarity for Charity groups, I I appreciate it when people come in and say, you know what, my mom has Alzheimer's. I can't wait until she dies. And then they get into this lifetime of my mom wasn't a very good mom. You know, and and I'm or other, and I want to care for her. I want to give her a fine goodbye. But I also have a lot of baggage. Um, and other people feeling resentful about caregiving. And I love these people because they're so honest about it, and they're in the trenches, even though they don't want to be. And so this stuff has to get out there, and see the light of day. I also, in regards to this idea of guilt or shame about our emotional responses or our private thoughts, um, uh, they're two powerful words. And I think distinguishing guilt and shame as two very different things is important. So guilt is often defined as feeling bad about our actions or choices. And so a caregiver might say, well, why did I yell at her? Why did I get so frustrated at her? Or, I should have spent more quality time with my mother and she was able to benefit from it. So that's the guilt. And then the shame is even more profound, which is feeling bad about who we are. So when those shortcomings really enter into our souls. I was an awful son to my father. And that, like, defining, I'm no longer Bruce. I'm the awful son, or I don't deserve such a wonderful dad. And that's where we get into these very, very private, very shameful, very hard to release experiences. And so, of course, how can we normalize these? We have to emote. We have to talk about them. Uh, we have to connect our feelings with the fact that we're human and other people have the same feelings, and that's what Hilarity for Charity support groups offer. And we laugh, we cry, we get angry, we get pissed off at each other sometimes. So
Yeah, and it's hard for sometimes people to realize that it just experiencing that full range of emotions is what makes us human. And that it's important to really feel. And that when you're laughing, you're feeling something, and that's okay, even in those moments that may seem really dark.
and for people to receive that, when we can laugh and not feel too embarrassed.
Casey, how can death doulas support the dying person and the people who love them emotionally, spiritually, and practically?
Great question. We give people autonomy over their own ending. As Alua mentioned before, death is something that, people don't really talk about. It's something that is kept in the shadows. And because of that, most people, they don't really plan for it. They just kind of let it happen to them. But it's not really something that you have to do. You don't have to let death just happen to you. We can actually, comprehensively plan for your death. And so part of the way that, I like to do that with people as a death doula is to help them create a death plan, which is similar to a birth plan, just on the opposite end of life. And I like to walk them through creating a sensory friendly death plan. So, what type of sounds can calm your nervous system? What type of sights do you want to see in those small moments that you open your eyes? What type of fabrics can, make you feel really safe and at home? And what type of people do you want around you in that really vulnerable moment? Really thinking about these things that, most people try to shy away from instead of thinking about. These are the things that we can really help walk people through and kind of bring to the forefront of their thinking when it comes to their end of life and planning for their final chapter. But, we don't just help the person who is at the end of their life, we help their loved ones too. When somebody is dying, it's not just that dying individual who is experiencing, death. It is all of their loved ones who are experiencing it too. And so everybody really needs support through that. And so when you create this plan, you can kind of loop everybody into the plan. And so, helping to explain and to educate about what is going to happen, as somebody is getting nearer to the end of their life and as death is getting closer, to take away that fear and that stigma just by increasing education can really change the way that people see and experience death. We can support the loved ones emotionally and spiritually by helping to just, give them a little bit of, autonomy over what's going on and give them things to do instead of just kind of sit there and, more or less watch their loved one and, die, more or less. So, and then also, a lot of times when I'm working with people, you find that, the dying individual is also oftentimes the person who was the caretaker for the people who are now watching them die. And so as the doula, I kind of like to step in to make sure that, we're filling that role now. So, as they're there, watching their loved ones take their last breath, I can be there to make sure that I'm providing emotional support for them, giving them time to step away so that they're not having to spend every moment there with their person. So just, really being there to provide support for everyone who's involved in a situation by providing education, by providing emotional support, by giving them that plan so that you can, even possibly make it a more beautiful experience, dare I say.
It occurs to me that so many of the things that Bruce was talking about, shame and guilt that we have after someone passes can be addressed and even possibly ameliorated by preparing and utilizing that time before someone passes to reconcile so many of those feelings. But we are a culture that is just so afraid of talking about death. We just don't talk about it. And Alua, you talk about this very idea in Briefly Perfect Human. You explore how acknowledging our mortality can actually help us live more fully. So what do you think becomes possible, both individually and culturally, when we're willing to just have a conversation or have conversations about death?
Yeah, I think one thing that kind of pairs with what both Bruce and Casey are saying is that what is happening in private suddenly does isn't so private anymore. You know, caregiving can feel so isolating. It, when my brother-in-law was dying, it felt like we were the only ones in the world that were in the middle of this horrendous thing that was happening to us. Never mind the fact that science tells us that there's 120,000 people dying every single day. It just felt like this huge thing was happening to us. And during that time, I did not have not only the awareness, but the additional support in terms of doulas. We also didn't have hospice support at the time, but we didn't have additional support to let us know that the things that were happening were normal and common, and our responses to them weren't wrong, and there was nothing to be ashamed of, and that this is kind of how dying happens. I felt less lonely when I learned that this is how dying happens. When we bring death out of the shadows, it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge our humanness. To acknowledge that I will die means to, first of all, acknowledge that I am fallible. And one day this body will come apart and die, and I am just like you in that way. But it also creates an opportunity for me to connect more deeply. Because when I'm talking about my death, everything in my life is sitting at the forefront. I'm thinking about my relationships. I'm thinking about my accomplishments. I'm thinking about how I've loved people. I'm thinking about my body. I'm thinking about my grief. I'm thinking about my inner world. So when I am present with my mortality, it allows me to be very present with my life. So on a one-on-one level, it allows us to see one another more clearly. I think it opens pathways for greater compassion. But on a larger scale, societally, well, shoot, how incredible would it be if our caregivers did not feel like they were in these silos, if there were some societal infrastructural support for the job of caregiving, where we could acknowledge that death is happening and other people are supporting other people through it. And so let's get some hands in there to continue the support. I think it's what death doulas are really trying to do. All the doulas that we've trained at Going with Grace are coming because they had an opportunity to support somebody through dying. And they thought, I want to see this change, big picture. I want to see this on a big scale. So as we continue to do it societally, I also happen to think that it will break down some of the barriers, the systems that keep us disconnected from one another. And then we offer greater support to our fellow human. Like, don't we all want that anyway? Like, right? I want other humans to feel supported through perhaps one of the worst things that they're going to journey through in their lives. Yeah, that's what acknowledging death can do for us.
Alua and Casey, I just want to ask you both in your work, um, how does spirituality, not religion, but spirituality play into the work that you do as death doulas? Casey, I'll start with you.
Oh man, spirituality plays into it so much. And, both religiously and not religiously, but on a not religious way, there's a lot of different things that happen when people are dying. People will see lost loved ones a lot of the time. And so letting them know that, these things happen to almost everyone and these things are normal, that can really help people to feel comfortable and let them know that. It's not you going crazy. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, that this is something that really happens. And you kind of mentioned earlier that feeling that you had when your dad died, that you felt like he was still around, right? So it's my belief that we are all just energy, and energy never dies, it only changes. And so it is kind of my belief that he was still just around you. And that's kind of how I look at death. And people always ask me, like, you must be so sad all the time and you just have the saddest job and all you do is work with people who are dying, right? But I've never been happier in my life. And I believe that all of the people that I work with, they're all still around me. They're all still helping me and guiding me through, this life that I have. And so, I believe that, spirituality plays into this on just such a bigger level than I ever knew. When I was a nurse and I was doing healthcare stuff, I just had no idea. It was just such a different level. Everything is kind of like mechanical and checking boxes and giving medications and this and that. But then when you go into death care and doing stuff in the death world and really looking into the spirituality of, being here and living and transitioning and what happens after we die. And I feel like now I know life and death so much more, and I see things so much clearer, that I am living more fully because of it. So I love the spirituality of all of it. It makes me feel so whole and so full. And I love to lean into that and to help my clients kind of lean into that as they're in their final chapter. Alua.
I'm so happy to hear you say that because I happen to take a different stance altogether. I believe that spirituality plays a big role. I prefer to take a very secular approach to allow the beliefs of my clients to sit at the center, because so often, and I'm sure Casey, you experience this all the time, but people think that we somehow happen to know what happens after we die. And of course, I have my belief system. I have a lot of beliefs. I've seen a lot of things happen that inform that belief, but I won't know until I die myself. And then if I come back to tell you, you might have some feelings about it. But until then, I would like to create a broad and blank enough slate so that my clients can reflect back whatever they believe. I notice that even the most religious amongst us, and here's a place where I'm probably tying religion and spirituality a little closer, but even the most religious amongst us, even those that have a strong sense of a spiritual background, still sometimes question what happens after we die because it's one of the major fears and anxieties that humans carry about death. And when they are in that place, when they start to question, I just want to pull it out of them. What is it that you believe? I want to create enough space so that they can get clear because they've got to come to some peace with it to facilitate their dying process. So I love playing around with the possibilities, and I think staying secular creates a lot of space for me to hear it all and to play around with it all. I've heard some things that I'm like, I really hope you get that. Okay. I don't know if I want it for me, but good for you. Good for you. Um, it's a central part of our dying. I think for many of us, we must come to terms with what we believe we are doing here and what this human experience is about in order to approach our dying with some resolve. Yeah. It's rich though. It's really, really rich.
Yeah. Bruce, when should someone consider professional grief counseling versus peer or community support? And are there ways in which all of them work together?
Hmm. Lisa, I'm going to ask you a question before I answer that question, which is that, yeah, I'd like to answer your question and weave it into a little bit to what Alua and Casey just spoke about. So first of all, earlier I mentioned complex grief, and I think uh, general grief is something we move into and we move out of it at our own pace. But sometimes it taps into either a depressive experience, or it might trigger some old trauma unrelated to loss, to the point where people can't function anymore in their daily lives. And they and you know, I've heard stories of people whose family and friends don't know how to handle their long-lasting grief, and it gets complicated. So I, I, I think it. I think anybody who's, number one, a caregiver for somebody with dementia, or somebody who's grieving after such a complex, slow loss, should have a therapist. Um, and I'd also like to add on to that the one in particular thing that happens for people who um, are experiencing ambiguous loss, caregiving for somebody with a serious terminal illness or dementia, is they slowly lose themselves. There's a kind of a loss of self. You're no longer the doctor or the lawyer or the clerk. You become a caregiver, and especially if you're caring for a parent or a spouse, you're not only a caregiver, but you almost become one unit. You know, we talk about care partners. You know, it's a partnership, and so we become one unit. So we live and breathe together, the same life going on and on and on. And when somebody dies, you know, it's like a part of us is removed suddenly. Um, so it's, and that's where I think psychology and spirituality and medicine, they kind of all intersect together. And when I started the bereavement group for HFC, it was right in the heart of COVID, and COVID precipitated a lot of complex trauma that this group is still talking about today. And a lot of them, you know, gave up their careers, not only to caregive, but also to hunker down. And so when their care partners died, they didn't know how to go back to living. It was very, very scary. So we'll leave it at that.
It's such an interesting point, Bruce, because in some cases these caretakers are caregiving for so long that they don't prepare themselves for what happens next. And it's I've heard of so many caregivers who are still experiencing PTSD because of it, because they were just so unprepared for when the finality of it, because they'd been doing it for so long.
Absolutely.
Casey and Alua, Casey, you were talking about how important it is to plan for all aspects of one's passing. And Alua, you were saying it's so important to normalize the conversation about death. So when in one's journey would you suggest that someone reach out to a death doula? Casey, I'll start with you because you might have a different opinion on it.
So I don't know that there's necessarily, a perfect timeline. You can really start working with a death doula at any time. So like hospice has guidelines, you have to have a terminal diagnosis with 6 months or less to live to work with hospice. But with a death doula, you can work with a death doula at any time. And when it comes to end of life planning, there's no particular time that you should start your end of life planning. I mean, you can do end of life planning when you're 18 years old, because I always like to say death doesn't discriminate. None of us have any idea when death is going to come for us. And so you should really start thinking of, your end of life planning and what you want that to look like at any time in adulthood. So, I mean, any of us could really reach out to a death doula at any time just to start, talking about planning and getting some ideas of what that might look like. I have people who have reached out to me at a very early age just because they want to start planning for the end of their life, and they want to be in touch with a death doula so that they know, whenever I do make it to, that point that I might need a death doula doula or start working with a death doula, I want to be in connection with one. I have people who have worked with a death doula just because they want to do legacy projects, even though they aren't necessarily, at the end of their life yet. They do want to create some sort of tangible project that they can leave behind for their loved ones. So really, whenever it feels good for you. Now, definitely, if you do receive a terminal diagnosis, and you are looking at some sort of like life-limiting illness, you should definitely reach out to a death doula. We can come into the picture before hospice can, and then we can help people to understand all of the benefits that hospice has to offer. We can help you sign on to hospice when it's time. We can help you to find the right hospice company for you. I work with a lot of clients who maybe they get a terminal diagnosis, but they aren't at that 6 months or less mark yet, so they've received a terminal diagnosis, but they're still getting palliative treatments. People who have brain change like Alzheimer's or dementia, it's really difficult for them to get signed on to hospice because they have to check a lot of, boxes and meet a lot of requirements in order to get the support of hospice. And so working with a death doula in that circumstance would be really beneficial too. So really, at any time, it would be beneficial to reach out to a death doula and talk to them, get an idea of what they can do, see who's in your area, and meet with a couple different death doulas and see who you vibe with the best, and see which one would be best for you.
I
Lou,
did
and
OKC. I totally did OKC. And also just want to add that I worked with a 16-year-old who wanted to do some end of life planning because his best friend and best friend's father died in a car accident. So as soon as he got his driver's license, he wanted to get his planning done. It was such a rich conversation because presumably this young man has his whole life ahead of him and nobody knows what will happen. But with any end of life plan, I suggest that people are looking at it consistently at major life events or changes. One of the things that, I mean, I think now is the right time for everybody. If you haven't already, this is it. This is it. Because we all know that one day it will happen. It's a guarantee. And so, for anybody who has some awareness of recognition of their mortality and can be with that fact in a way that can allow us to get some planning done, is somebody who should begin planning for the end of their lives. And when that plan is made, let's look at it again when you move, if you have children, if you divorce, because you might want to change some things in there if you divorce. If when you move house, when you sell a house, when a parent dies, if you have a serious illness, if you have a diagnosis of life limitation, at the various life stages, it's a good time to look at an end of life plan. So now is a great time. Yeah, and let us support you along the way.
and just curious, I mean, for those who, for example, the 16-year-old that reached out to you, just out of curiosity, for people who have no idea what it means to work with a death doula, what are some of the initial things that you might do with someone who doesn't necessarily see that sort of end in sight immediately?
I'd probably start just asking them why they want to start planning, just so I can understand where they're coming from. A lot of people come, I think, because they believe that they want to get their affairs in order. We hear this term so much. Yet, affairs in order looks like different things depending on who you're talking to. People often know that you should have a will or a trust of some sort to handle your affairs, your possessions, and your money. But I think it's wildly important that we spend some time thinking about our desires for life support, who will make our decisions for us in the event that we cannot, what kind of comfort and care we want to receive, some of the things that Casey was talking about earlier, like the ambiance in the room and any sensory experience, thinking about what happens with your body after you die, your services, if at all. Certainly your possessions, any dependents, any adult disabled folks that are in your care, any pets, your children, consider your important biographical information, your documents, but most importantly, think about your life. Like, what is this thing that I've been doing here? Who have I been? Who have I loved? What did I care about? What in this life felt like it was worth living for me? That's the real value in end of life planning when you're still healthy.
I've also worked with a lot of people who have just a genuine fear of death, that are just terrified of death. And so they want to work with a death doula just to understand death a little bit more, because the more that you understand it, the more it can remove the fear. And so a lot of times when you just get down to like, okay, well, what is it that you're so afraid of? Well, I'm terrified that I'm going to die in pain. Okay, well, that's not, if you work with hospice and depending on what your, disease or whatever you're dying from, there's a lot of ways that we can assure that you won't die in pain, so if you really can just kind of talk through death, and then also a lot of people are, afraid that they're going to die alone. And so when you talk through the things that they're really afraid of, you can help to remove a lot of fear and anxiety as well.
Bruce, is there a way to prepare for grieving, to prepare to grieve? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I went to a conference on grief a couple of years ago, and it's actually a rather simple answer to that question. And for some people, when they go through a grief process, they wake up. They discover that all their lives they've been kind of in this kind of a fog of just daily duties, parenting, and all of that, and the pain and the emotional stimulation wakes them up. So part of the preparation has to do with tapping into being alive. So, you know, things like I think Alua and Casey have been saying, doing some planning. And one thing I know a lot of people don't do is they don't prepare legacies for after somebody dies. So whether it's a videotape of a grandmother telling the story of kind of emigrating from Europe, or plaster casts of their hands, they have their old death masks, or writing down all of that. So that's part of it, preparing by creating a legacy that will last far after death. And I think the other thing is it was mentioned, the sensory, activating sensory modalities to feel alive and to feel pleasure again. So nature, looking at diet, sleep, hydration, all of these things are going to make you a stronger person to be able to weather the tough times, because it's going to be hard.
Bruce, um, how do you know when it's the right time to activate those sensory activities, especially when you just don't feel like you want to?
It's, uh, I think a lot about, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Body Keeps the Score, or there are a lot of wonderful meditation teachers, and all of these things talk about that we can get into funks. We can be lazy. We can be apathetic. We can space out. We can use drugs and alcohol to kind of so any kind of a mindfulness-based skills are really important to ground ourselves in an effort to be present, and then tapping into networks of support, because a lot of activating readiness and all of that we can't do by ourselves, because psychologically we're not really consciously aware of our needs when we're in those places. So creating a care team, which I think both Casey and Alua talked about. They work in a care team environments where you have people who are in charge of food, nourishment. You have people who are scheduled to check in on you every single day, go on walks, and go to movies and things like that. So because we do want to be present. I think it's much better being present through all of these processes, because in the moment it hurts like hell, but afterwards a lot of people are so grateful that they were able to be aware and present.
Well, yeah, because it's just so heavy and overwhelming if you don't have that preparation and you don't even know where to start to
Yeah.
begin to grieve, but also just get your life back in order and get your body going again. It's just it certainly can feel overwhelming. I can say that from experience. Um, I want to ask each of you if you can offer one suggestion or one small shift that care partners can make today to approach grief and dying with a little more honesty and compassion. Alu, I'll start with you.
What a big, beautiful question, Lisa. Uh, What came up immediately for me was what Bruce was just alluding to, which is the presence, like the 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 honoring and the acknowledging of current needs. And it can be so hard to do when there's somebody you care about or somebody who you're charged with taking care of who needs you a lot. Um, but I think part of the challenge with caregiving is also learning to honor your own in process. And so when we can learn to be a little bit more present with what our needs are, um, I think it can allow us to continue sharpening that skill for the journeys that come in the future. I don't know that it makes it any easier or better at all, but I think it maybe allows us greater capacity for our humanness and to let other people see and hold us in our humanness.
Casey, would you like to share any thoughts on that? Like one shift that care partners can make to just make the approach to grief and dying feel more compassionate and honest.
Yeah, I'd like to say changing the narrative a little bit. We've always been taught as a culture that talking about death and grief is just something that we don't do. And so people stuff those feelings and those thoughts and those questions and they keep them inside of them instead of just talking about it. And if we talk about this stuff with our family, with our friends, if we if we talk about our end of life planning and if we really get this stuff out more, if we just change that narrative and stop being so afraid to openly talk about these things, I think that that can really make a huge difference.
Bruce, any thoughts from you?
Similar to I think this conversation, I think finding a tribe, because there is with grief, like any severe pain, there's a tendency to want to crawl under a rock, and I think you can't do that. So I think finding a tribe, and it has to be a tribe who's willing and capable of being a tribe member, which it was why a therapist, a well-trained therapist, can be very helpful. But um, another part of the tribe, like the HFC groups, are amazing because as people care for the dying, there's always people who are caring for end of life issues, and then there's people in the groups that are caring for uh, early diagnosis issues, and everybody gets to kind of support everybody else. And um, you find people who've been there. I can't tell you how many times people have said, my friends and family, they can't stand me talking about, changing my mother's diaper. So you got to find people like our men's group. We love talking about personal care diaper products. It's really lovely. So find a tribe.
Did you say your men's group likes to talk about those things?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Any guys out there, I'm sorry I disclosed that. That's personal.
Hey, whatever it takes, and I'm glad you found your tribe to be able to talk about those intimate things.
Yeah.
And I want to thank this tribe for having this really beautiful, moving, honest conversation about, again, something that we will all experience ourselves, but we will all experience when it comes to our loved ones. And so, Bruce, Casey, and Alua, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And thank you all for tuning in. We are going to have a 5-minute intermission, and I hope that everyone will join back in the lobby after 5 minutes elapses for the incredible Scotty Awards. Thank you all so much, and have a beautiful and meaningful rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.